So tonight we're very lucky to have the opportunity to be speaking with Rosemary Kayess, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities first Australian representative. On a personal note, I was lucky to have been selected to attend the United Nations in New York as part of the youth delegation sponsored by the Human Rights Commission and the Australian Government back in 2014. And I was chosen to represent PWDA, which is how I came to really enjoy and love our organisation. So as a delegation, we were mentored by Rosemary and our co-CEO, Therese Sands. And under their mentoring and tutelage, it put in motion a passion to engage and begin my own future as a disability leader. So I'm so personally thrilled to be interviewing Rosemary tonight. So tonight Rosemary will talk a little bit about her objectives while on the committee, including bringing greater clarity to state parties implementing the CRPD and helping ensure the convention is met across the board of people with disability in education, justice, health and political representation, as well as countries and cultures. There will be an opportunity from the floor and also via webcast to ask questions. Would you like to say a few words before we start, Rosemary?
Well, certainly. I just have to correct you on one tiny little thing. I'm not the first Australian. Ron McCallum was our first member on the committee and did an excellent job. I'm the first Australian woman. Hopefully there will be plenty of Australian women that follow in my footsteps. A few of you here tonight can think about that as a career trajectory. But I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I hear you've had a very successful AGM, so you've got a nice strong leadership to take you forward and to continue the really good work that PWD has done, not just domestically but internationally. The reputation you've acquired is very, very strong, and your work is very respected.
Thank you. And I apologise for the little slip. Yes. So I guess I'll just start off with a few questions in regards to the leadership side of how you came to be in the chair that you're in. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities sets out in detail how recognised international human rights law should be implemented on the context of persons with disabilities. In Australia, what do you think that we should be doing more of to push the CRPD agenda?
There's so many fronts that we can move on, but I think what we need to really do is embrace the conceptualisation of disability that CRPD embraces, and that's around disability as one aspect of human diversity. And if we approach policy, if we approach design, if we approach town planning and the way in which our society is structured, where disability is just one element and is factored in, then we won't see the same levels of social isolation, economic and political exclusion that people with disabilities have experienced up until now. We will move away from that focus on specialised services, segregated services and segregated institutions, and look at a much more inclusive society.
Thanks, Rosemary. So how did it feel to be elected, and what has surprised you the most since?
Look, I was incredibly humbled by the support that the disability sector gave me when it was suggested that I might run for the committee. I was really, really honoured to be Australia's nominee. And I was really thrilled to be the first woman to be elected. That first day, there was 30 candidates initially, and as we got closer to the vote, several of the African nominees dropped out, and so it wasn't as difficult an ask, but there was still 25 candidates. And so the potential for there being several rounds of voting was very real. So it could have been a really quite tense day, but luckily I got through in the first round. There were 4 of us that were elected in the 3 of us that were elected in the first round. So I could walk out of that first session and breathe easy because the job had been done. I didn't have to sweat on the next round of elections, which they say becomes much more parochial, and so it could have been a very different outcome if we'd gone to more than one round of elections. So relief was basically what I felt. Since then I've been overwhelmed with people's congratulations. I am really, and again, I'm really quite humbled with how excited everybody is with my election to the committee. The other thing that astounds me is that I'm still the same person. I've still got the same ideas and knowledge that I had in May, that I have in June, but now everybody wants me to come and have a chat with them, come and speak at different things. Not that I mind doing that, but it's really quite interesting. I didn't think I would be as in demand as I've become. They'll learn.
So I know how important female role models can be when inspiring young people with disability to have a voice. So who were your role models and why? I know that's a cliche question, but it's the role that you're in.
We have such impressive female leaders in the disability sector on the global level. One of them's in this room. The other one works at the World Bank.
Yep. Charlotte
McLean-Lappo, a South African American who was on the South African Human Rights Commission, who I met 20 years ago and has always been a major inspiration to me. But we have some homegrown heroes here. Robin Banks has always been a hero to me as a lawyer, as an advocate. She has a very strong legal mind, and I'm first and foremost a lawyer, and so I've really enjoyed her leadership, but also she's been a strong role model for me. And my ability to work with Therese Sands has been an absolute pleasure and a joy, and she has a focus and an understanding that is second to none. And I hope to be able to continue that work.
That's fantastic. I'm sure you will. Yes. I mean, I guess in that sense, I mean, it's to be a leader, it's quite to keep motivated. So what keeps you motivated to keep fighting on disability issues, especially the most frustrating ones in policy?
That's probably why I work in the law and I don't work in the policy. People may have noticed that I'm fairly thin on the ground when it comes to DPO action and domestic action. It's because I do tend to work in that legal ambit. It's where I'm comfortable. I'm a lawyer, that's where I feel confident about my analysis, and it's probably where I do my best work. I'm also an academic, and so I don't work at the coalface, so I think people that are engaged with people on a daily basis and are working in DPOs have a much more credible voice than me. I bring a set of skills that are very, very different, and I try to keep that expertise in its place in a legal context.
Wonderful. So in terms of a legal context, what are some of the most important legal and political issues that we need to address now, both internationally and for Australia, do you reckon?
I think if we embrace the notion that the CRPD is about building inclusive communities that is based on disability as just one aspect of the human condition, then the fundamentals such as legal capacity need to be addressed, they need to be recognised. People need to be seen, recognised and acknowledged as rights bearers and all that means in the legal context. And so once we can achieve that, and that's not an easy task because what it does is it challenges the essentialism of the reasonable construct behind liberal law. Classical liberal theory is what structures our legal framework, and the concept around reasonable autonomous beings is the fundamental basis of that. And to say that everybody has legal capacity challenges that. And so it will not be an easy road, but it's an incredibly important road.
Yeah, especially around the supported decision-making framework and such.
Supported decision-making, but the assumption that everybody, regardless of disability, is an autonomous, rational being is a bit of a stretch.
It is. It is. So for young leaders, in that sense, we see a lot of self-confidence is a big barrier for young people with disabilities, but also anybody with disabilities who wishes to speak on such huge platforms about the issues. Where did you find your own self-confidence? Do you think you have it now, or do you have to keep working on it as a global leader, do you feel?
I got my self-confidence around the dining table at home. I am a product of my parents.
Yeah.
My parents sought our opinions. They expected us to give our opinions. We now think it's our God-given right to give our opinions. My mother was an incredibly intelligent woman. My father was an incredibly clever man, but they loved each other dearly, and I grew up in an incredibly supportive family. I was, middle of the road, middle class, white Australian, suburban, slightly less than suburban girl, and had all the opportunities that came with. So I was educated in that context, and then I acquired my disability through a car accident. So that traumatic experience for me highlighted the disconnect with how people with disability are treated compared to people that aren't labelled as somebody with a disability. And so I keep my confidence from that white middle-class girl that's well educated, well loved, and is well supported. And I try and give something back. The confidence is never going to go. I don't know how I keep it up, because I find myself in situations sometimes when I just think, you're kidding yourself, Rosemary, you haven't got a clue. But, you never hear me shut up and not have an opinion. And I blame my parents. May they both rest in peace.
I'm so thrilled. No. It's, so I've got some questions from the members in regards to that people have really been setting out to ask via Twitter and Facebook. So the first question from Alsa Rayner. So she would like to ask Rosemary whether her right to self-determination in health extends her mind to capacity, and whether this is to be a platform that you will argue for those who have mental diagnosis.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I wouldn't see legal capacity as a fundamental in terms of meeting CRPD obligations if I didn't see that it had a role to play across all 30 operative articles. Health, particularly important. It will be an incredibly challenging thing to achieve. I think there is, massive corporate interests that need to be addressed, and there is massive professional interests that need to be addressed. There's an incredible lot of clinical training that needs to shift focus and understanding. So it's not going to be an easy transformation, but CRPD gives us the groundwork. I'm a bit of a black letter lawyer. I want to hold the committee to a translation that is committed to a strong legal analysis, and so it's very difficult to shift from a position that people with disability legal capacity is recognised, and that translates across all articles.
So another question for Irene McMinn is that the recent report put out by the World Federation of Deaf Blind and International Disability Alliance says that the deaf-blind people are in danger of being left out of the CRPD and SDGs. What can be done to prevent this from happening?
Look, small communities are always going to have to ensure that they have a voice. And that's the role that cross-disability organisations need to grapple with in terms of how they ensure their membership is heard, that their membership is truly diverse, and that strong voice and analysis reaches all their membership. And also for governments to recognise that rights under Article 30 and political participation are about supporting the development of disability organisations, both cross-disability but also disability-specific. And so it's about whether governments recognise that disability groups need support and need to be funded effectively to have a voice, because CRPD places an obligation on states to give a voice to people with disability in the implementation and monitoring. And so that means ensuring that everybody is represented in that process.
It's so important. Chanel McKenna asks her question in a 2-in-1 question. She asks, why isn't there any awareness campaigns regarding domestic violence against people with disabilities, and why are women and girls with disabilities still forced to undergo forced sterilisations globally?
Really good question. I wish I knew the answer. It completely befuddles me. I mean, when we've got countries like the UK, Germany, Belgium saying quite distinctly to Australia, prohibit forced sterilisation. Yet we know that Australia is not the only country that has ways and means for sterilisation of young women and girls with disability, but also young men It is a very gendered issue, but it doesn't only relate to women in the disability sphere. The legal framework's there. It's about being diligent, and I think for the committee the role is to be incredibly diligent and to make sure that sexual and reproductive rights and freedom from torture is really strongly monitored through the committee processes.
So I guess in this, leading into legal and policy, Colleen McGrath asks, it's quite a complex question, but I suppose in terms of a domestic policy and legal, why do I have drawn-out battles with the NDIA, particularly in the provision of assistive technology?
Look, I'm not the person to answer that. I'm not a domestic policy person. But what I can say is that what the CRPD would be looking for, the CRPD would be looking for a strong, supported right to a grievance. So there should be a right to a remedy. So there must be mechanisms for people with disability that are not onerous, that are accessible, and are supported with appellate frameworks to be able to not have drawn out he said, she said battles, but to have a right of reply to the agency and then have formal grievance procedures. The committee would be looking for, well, the committee should be looking for ensuring that that funding doesn't have a gender bias, that funding is not leaving people without the right to technological developments and assistive technology as put forward in Article 9, that there is awareness raising and that there is professional development within the agency to ensure that they have a solid, skilled workforce that isn't just defaulting to insurance mode and saying no, hoping people will go away.
I mean, it's I suppose that would be the one thing to really fight on, is that the NDIS is such an interesting dimension to other countries in how it's performing. It'd be...
There are insurance models in a lot of the Northern European countries, slightly different frameworks. It will be very interesting to see how the NDIS rolls out. The NDIA is an incredibly major player. The strength of the NDIS is its insurance model, but it's also its weakness if the NDIA doesn't do what it's supposed to do in terms of ensuring mainstream Australia is much more inclusive. So until we've got good, accessible, inclusive mainstream structures, there is always going to be a larger ask for the NDIS. The more inclusive the community becomes, the less specialist disability supports will be needed, and so there won't be as much financial pressure on the NDIS. So it's about making sure they don't lose sight of the balance that needs to be achieved with the NDIS. The objectives are for people to be able to participate and become, participating members of the community, and they can only achieve that, and Australia can only financially sustain that if we actively build an inclusive community.
Very true. Thank you for that. Yes, I agree with that statement very much. Absolutely. That concludes my questions and the members' questions. I'm going to hand you to the mercy of the floor. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask Rosemary tonight? Do not be shy. Any question, big or small? Ramola's around with the microphone, so if you've got a question, she will be bringing it over to you. Does anyone have a question at all? Ben has a question.
Thanks, Rosemary. This is a question that's come in via our webcast, and it is, what is the UN's position on the NDIS? And further to that, what advice would the UN give to Australia about this vital service?
The UN doesn't have a position on the NDIS. What the UN has a position on is whether people with disability have access to supports, whether they're adequately funded, whether there is a right to a remedy if people aren't getting access to the supports that they need. What they will want to know is whether there's any gender bias in the application of the support process, whether people are being discriminated against if there's any other bias of personal characteristics such as sexual orientation, intersex, transgender, age. And so it will be interested in that transition age of 64 through to the aged care system to see if there's any discrimination component about that. And they will also be looking at how those supports meet the objectives and purposes of the Convention in people with disabilities living independently and being included as part of the community. But as the NDIS, they're really not interested in the policy structure per se, but more about the outcomes and whether those outcomes are being achieved in a non-discriminatory fashion. And if they are happening, that there's a right to a remedy.
Does anyone have a...
Hi Rosemary, my name is Cheryl and I am a person with a disability, but I'm also the mother of 2 young women who have disabilities, so I have a lot of concerns in a lot of areas. So one of the things that I'm really concerned about is how the NDIS is addressing the needs of people with severe disabilities by taking a large portion of that and placing it on the carer's shoulders and just going, yeah, but you're the mum, you can do that. And how does that fit with CRPD, with the actual rights? Like my daughter Terry, who's accompanying me tonight, is 30 years old. She doesn't want mum hanging around her shoulders all the time. And for a government organisation to then see themselves as having the power to impose me upon her, I think is really wrong, and it doesn't seem to me to fit with the CRPD at all.
No, the services should be age appropriate. So there is an age and gender perspective throughout the CRPD. So it does try and look at intersectional issues. And so that's something that if the data holds up in terms of the rollout of NDIS and how it's operating in people's lives, that they are losing that right to independence that should be guaranteed, then those services, if those services are not age appropriate, then there is a violation.
Thank you.
Kevin, you have a question?
Sorry about it. Rosemary, Kevin Boyce, I'm a current board member of PWDA. I'm very interested in hearing the state and federal governments talking about inclusion now and not segregation of individuals. I challenge them to take the word or the tag word disability out of their vocabulary. What do you think?
Look, I think there'll be a day when disability becomes a little bit redundant. At the moment, I think we still need to claim some space to be able to ensure that there is a focus and that there is the policy debate. I think we need to mature, not necessarily us as people with disability, but I think our politics and our policies need to mature somewhat more before I would be prepared to take what I see as that vertical element of the disability specific out of the conversation.
Yeah, I agree with you, but something's wrong with our society. I mean, people that follow the Collingwood Football Club in Melbourne have definitely got a disability. People that drive a whole motor car definitely have a disability, you know, but they're not tagged, are they? Oh, are they?
Well, Collingwood supporters definitely are. Look, and not everybody with an impairment is tagged as a person with a disability. And so that's what I mean when I say we don't have the level of maturity both in our politics and our policy to understand the true concepts around disability. Anybody that's in this room that's got a pair of glasses on has an impairment and could be or should be or may actually define themselves as a person with a disability. But what we do in terms of our policy here in Australia is that we mainstream it. You know, there's an optometrist in every shopping centre. Eye health is something that is factored in policy-wise. Eyewear is cheap, it's affordable, it's accessible to everybody. Take that same level impairment and put it in somewhere like Zimbabwe, and the level of disability is much more significant. So until we have the maturity and the nuance and the society that is much more inclusive, I think we're at risk of leaving people with disability segregated because there won't be that focus. Whilst it's still a label, we can fight for that label, we can fight for the resources for that label and for the inclusion of that label. Hopefully one day that label will be irrelevant, but I can't see it happening in my lifetime, sadly.
Daunting. It is a daunting prospect, isn't it? Well, Elle has a question.
I do. I'm really interested in hearing more about your work on the CRPD and what else is happening around the world with other people with disability and the kinds of issues that we have in common but also not in common in terms of the kinds of issues that come before the committee that are not issues that we necessarily face in Australia.
Look, the CRPD has been my professional life since 2000. It put an absolute full stop to my PhD. The central thesis of my PhD was that we needed an international instrument, and then the bloody UN decided to have one. So it's 7/8 into a PhD and, oh, fuck that then. And then Philip French says to me, well, you've got to go to New York, you've got to work on it. Well, thanks, Philip. Speaking of a bit of a girly role model, there's another one. So my legal practice in terms of working on the development of the convention And then all the work that I've done around the monitoring here in Australia and feeding that into the international context has really been my professional, academic and legal work over the last 15 years. So I'm heavily invested in it. So I would really like to see it succeed. I can't say that anyone has got world leadership in this space. Everyone has strengths. Europe has some fabulous frameworks, but not necessarily got all the bells and whistles implementation. It suffers from a federated situation like we do, but a much more complex one. You know, they've got a little recalcitrant state that wants out. Well, it thinks it wants out, but maybe it doesn't. And the US, well, yeah, okay. I think I'll just leave that well alone. And yet, in some ways, developing countries have an opportunity to start from scratch. So Article 32 becomes incredibly important. Disability inclusive development is a critical element, and potentially an incredible potential for developing countries to get in front, because they're starting with a clean slate. So they could go from having people chained to trees to being very supportive in terms of legal capacity and providing supports in local communities and being inclusive, because they're starting without the vested interests that we have to fight against. And there are global vested interests. Big Pharma will be a big block. There will be entrenched systems of segregated education that will be difficult to break, not because it's about whether kids are in classrooms, but because it's an established system with established industrial relation systems that threaten people's power and patch. So the debate's not about disability at all, but it's people with disability that get the rough end of the pineapple. So there will be small pockets of leadership, but I can't point anywhere that is doing anything outstanding. And so the space is there for global leadership. It's just who's prepared to take up that challenge. Hopefully we might have some no, we probably won't. We might have some political leadership at some point. I don't see it in the next couple of terms of Parliament. I think it's going to take us a while to get back to problem-solving parliaments. I don't see either sides of our politics getting much beyond partisan politics, and what we need is problem solving. And I don't know when we'll see it again. And unfortunately, it will be people with disability that get caught in the crossfire. Oh, that was a downer. Next.
We have one question coming from the webinar, so from Ben.
Rosemary, we have got a question come in via Twitter from Stephen Karuna, who asks, people with disability encompass a large proportion of all detention settings. How do we ensure governments and inspection bodies are responsive to CRPD principles in implementing and ongoing monitoring processes of OPCAT? How might you address this in your role?
Good question.
Oh, well, I wouldn't have had the national safeguards structure set up like it was, but, you know, they didn't ask me, so. But they asked some very clever people and they still ignored them. Look, the human rights lawyer in me says we need a Human Rights Act. Unfortunately, we're going to do the piecemeal process to that outcome. We've now got potentially three Human Rights Acts going to be on the table, the Victorian, the ACT and potentially Queensland that's gone for its first reading. Admittedly, they're all civil political rights. They will mature as legal jurisdictions and understand that economic, social and cultural rights are justiciable, but that will take a little bit of legal maturity. No, political maturity. I think the legal maturity could be there. The good thing about having the Human Rights Acts at state level, there will be judicial education. They will need within their state jurisdiction to engage with international law. So we may get a bit of judicial education and reliance on international law that we in Australia have been sadly lacking. I don't know why our judiciary ignores international law, but some of the examples that have come out of Victoria have been positive. And so if that's the developing and the maturing of the judiciary, then I have greater confidence for the direction of Australia for its use of discrimination law, but also broader areas of law as people with disability engage with consumer law and tenancy law because of the effects of NDIS.
Okay. We've got time for one or two more questions. Does anybody have a burning question that they would like to get off while we have? Yes.
Thanks. Rachel Spencer from Council for Intellectual Disability. Our colleague and friend Robert Strike would have liked to have been here tonight, and I'm sure he'd be happy for me to ask a question on behalf of our organisation. Rosemary, in your role on the committee, what will you do to ensure that people from smaller groups and smaller communities, as you mentioned, and groups of people with disability that haven't always had a voice or a seat at the table, how will you ensure, I guess, that they aren't left behind, both in Australia but also in other countries that you'll be reviewing?
Well, the black letter lawyer in me takes the, I'm going to use legal terms, but the interpretive matrix of the convention for me is my guiding legal process, and so I would take intersectionality quite seriously. I would take the purpose and objectives of all people with disability seriously, and so it's important that we engage with people that recognises all the modes and means of communication, that there's access for everybody to the information and the development of the law, so that we're not just producing materials for governments and their justice departments, that we're producing international law for the diversity of the community so everybody can access it. And if they've got access to the information and access to the system, they can have a voice in the system. But that can only happen if the processes recognise the various means and modes of communication and information that people require. And it's about being diligent with that and about asking questions that, through the general principles and through the requirements and obligations of the articles, that require governments to think beyond what used to get labelled during the convention negotiation as traditional disabilities. So blind people, deaf people, people in wheelchairs. We need to move beyond that and recognise that disability is an incredibly diverse community and that we need to be able to reach everybody and they need to be able to reach us. And we've got Robert Martin still. And I think that has really challenged the UN. And I think with the engagement of Robert with the hearings will challenge governments. And I think it's a good challenge.
I think it's a wonderful challenge. We have time for one more question. Does anybody have a burning question that they would like to ask and be the lucky last to ask Rosemary a question? Yay, Stephen. Microphone coming to you.
Thank you. There's a lot of my colleagues here that would question whether I need a microphone, but it's a question of something that's very dear to my heart, a matter I have a lot to do with professionally, and that is the question of legal capacity. A lot of the work I do is based around tribunals, guardianship orders, the injustice of guardianship orders, getting them revoked. And one of the things that I argue very, very often is a person's legal capacity, their right to a legal capacity, and when the level of that capacity, when can they say that they don't have it? I would be interested to know if there are any international things with the convention that actually govern that. And I know that you mentioned the idea of a legal capacity before. Your feelings about this matter, which I think is utterly vital for people's rights to self-determination.
Look, as I said before, there are pockets of things that are happening. For me, legal capacity is, I would love to say it's a short-term game, but it's not going to be a short-term game. We're most probably better placed here in Australia than lots of other jurisdictions to be able to start addressing this. We start from a fairly advantageous position in the sense that what we've got to deal with is recognisable, whereas in lots of countries it is a system that is state-run, state-governed and not accessible. So advocates don't have access to the system. It's very hard to argue against because of the nature of the regime. So at least we've got domestic avenues to be able to have the debate. So that's one positive. But it's also problematic for, I don't know which comes first, the chicken or the egg. People with disability, people without disability learn decision-making skills and develop decision-making skills through trusted relationships. None of us make decisions by ourselves. It doesn't matter however much we kid ourselves, we always talk to somebody about our decisions that we make. And as the importance of those decisions grow, the more trust that we need in our support networks. So if we've got a cohort of people with disability that have been socially isolated and don't have those trusting relationships, how can we expect them to be able to develop decision-making skills overnight? So it's about getting them out of closed communities where they don't have the opportunity to develop relationships, trusting relationships. They don't engage with people to be able to have choices put before them, to learn what it is to actually make a choice, to make a decision. And so, yes, we can technically endow people with legal capacity, but we need to make it so people have the ability to exercise that. And that is going to have to be about starting from scratch for a lot of people. And one of your colleagues in the room just absolutely rang a clarity bell in a class of mine once when she said, how can people make a decision when they've never been asked what they want? And that is so fundamental. We need to get people out of closed communities and into the community and able to develop the social networks that we all have and all need to live independently. Living independently is a bit of a misnomer, because to truly succeed in society, you have to have trusting relationships and loving relationships. And you don't get those in closed communities when you're isolated from the rest of society and vulnerable to not only violence and abuse, but also vulnerable to having all your choices taken away from you. I know that doesn't really answer your question. I suppose the short answer is I think we need to work on a couple of things in parallel to be able to achieve what I see as a medium-term goal, because I don't see it as a short-term success.
And what makes us a real guardianship so intolerable, so unjust? I mean, that short, in a nutshell, is what it's about: taking away That's what I say. Taking away a person's right to have a decision.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, yeah, and I would say that is probably the first argument that we have to start with, and the recognition. Yeah, I agree with you. And it's the recognition that we need to find better ways to support people organically. And I think that is going to have to require some mechanical supported decision-making, so structured supported decision-making, because we'll have a cohort of people that don't have the organic means to be able to make those decisions and be supported, or the opportunity.
Please. Yeah, no, that's fine. I was actually going to ask a follow-on question to that. Do you mind? You can be the last one. I was just going to ask in terms of the access to justice, in terms of the supported decision making and the opportunity to legal capacity, but also the opportunity to participate in the justice process. I mean, how are you finding that in the CRPD for that to be implemented fairly and objectively?
Look, access to justice for anybody is pretty tricky. But for people with disability, it's incredibly problematic. The more we try and include people, we seem to be able to abuse their human rights more and more successfully. Indefinite detention is the classic example of that. Our inability to move beyond archaic infrastructure for juries and court processes is a level of immaturity that I just don't understand. And the good thing about it is that there are strong procedural arguments that needs to change. And so there's a movement in terms of access to justice. Australia is behind the 8 ball, and I think they will get dragged a bit kicking and screaming. But there's been movements in other jurisdictions that might foster some change here in Australia.
That's it. Cheryl. Last question from Cheryl.
In my experience, planners from the NDIA are actively blocking the independence of people with disabilities, particularly with more severe disabilities. An example of that was last year when I told them I would need to go to hospital for some operations and my daughter would need extra support for overnight care. And the planner looked me in the eye and said, well, if you're not going to be there, you have to face the fact your daughter has to move into supported independent living. My daughter is a homeowner. I rent from her.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things wrong with that I did, yeah. But look, one of the big questions that raises is the quality and the understanding of the staff that are operating within those agencies. The second thing is that clearly congregate care is not supported by CRPD, and so no, and so I will remind you once again, I'm not a domestic policy person, so I can't tell you the mechanisms here in Australia, but in terms of CRPD, that's not its objectives. Its objectives are about living independently and being included in the community. Requiring families to provide supports is not supported by the CRPD. Things need to be age appropriate. Families need to be kept together, not to support adults with disability, but to be the nurturing relationships that families and growing families are. But people with disability have a right to independence upon maturity that's age appropriate, and CRPD would see anything that requires people with disability to be infantilised and dependent on their family when they are mature adults as being a violation.
That concludes our final question, which went off with a bang. Thanks, Cheryl, for that. I, for one, am thrilled that you've been able to speak with us tonight. We bumbled along at the start, but we found a really good medium somewhere down there. I'm really, really stoked that you've been making available to speak to our members and, in your busy schedule. Yeah, it's a much privilege. We have a token of appreciation for you.
Thank you very much.
From all of us. Thank you very much for attending.
It's a nice shaped gift.
Yeah. That will be much fun.
Thank you
to
very
consume.
much. It was not a difficult decision to make to come and speak at the PWDA AGM. I admire the work that the organisation does, and you're going from strength to strength at the moment. It's fabulous to see, and so I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to come and join you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And a huge congratulations for your election. That owes another applause. We need that.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for everybody who've been able to make it tonight. There's still food at the back, still grab some. And for those that have tuned in on our webcast, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I wish you all a good night and a really fabulous year. Okay, bye.
Thanks, Kelly.